So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our special event. My name is Michael Newman. I'm the Chief Executive of the AJR. Most of you I've had the pleasure of meeting before, but we might be joined by new members, people we haven't yet interacted with before, and maybe people who are less familiar with the work of the AJR. So welcome, everybody. This is one of a series of events that we have organized in recent months and weeks, where we brought together colleagues from around the world to share and discuss interesting subjects of mutual interest. So I'm delighted this afternoon to welcome colleagues this time from Canada. So good afternoon, Deborah Levison, and also Marilyn Sinclair.
Thank you.
Just before we get into the meat of the event this afternoon, just to remind everybody that, of course, the role of the AJR is to provide a whole series of social welfare activities. And while we're delighted to put on events like we are doing today, the main thrust of what we do is to provide that social welfare assistance for first generation survivors and refugees. So if you or anybody you know could benefit from any of our services, then please do let us know, especially at this difficult time when people are experiencing a very challenging set of circumstances. So please do be in touch with us. Also, just a bit of light housekeeping for you for this event. If you want to make a comment or raise a question, then please send a message in the chat function to my colleague Deborah Barnes, who will be monitoring the questions. And also that we, as you can see, we've muted everybody for this part of the event. And that's really just to save on the background noise, to let our speakers do their magic. And also that the event is being recorded. So if you don't want your face to appear on the recording, then you can turn your video off but keep your audio on. And also to debunk a myth that if your audio is off, that does not mean that you can't hear. So you'll still be able to hear things. We've had this question before, that's why I raised the point. So just before I, in fact, hand over to Marilyn, I wanted to use this opportunity to, I suppose, just touch base briefly about the project of Liberation 75, which was something that I was personally very much involved in. And Marilyn, you were the brains, the convener, the agitator, the cook, bottle shop, everything washer connected with the project. So I guess it's a bit of bittersweet that in some ways that we can still do these events because of features and functions like Zoom. But at the same time, I have to say publicly in commiseration that we can't do it this year, but we will do it. I think the aim is to do it next year. We'll put a positive slant on it. But do you want to just share with our guests today, because although it was publicized in the AJR journal and AJR information about what the aim or the idea was, perhaps you could just have a couple of sentences or so explaining what Liberation 75, I'll say was, but still is.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Michael. I really appreciate that. Well, so here, this is Liberation 75. And I see some of the names that are popping on today are people who were very much involved in Liberation 75. Liberation 75 was created to be the largest gathering of Holocaust survivors, descendants, we call it educators, students, and friends, to commemorate the important 75th anniversary of liberation from the Holocaust. I started planning it in late 2017. What I did is I reached out to groups around the world trying to find one who was already doing something like this, so I could just attach myself to it, and couldn't find anybody, so we had to build it ourselves. It really was a continuation of something that happened 40 odd years ago with the gathering movement of the 1980s, which was such an important point in time because it was the first time that survivors and their children came together in movements across the world to say, we're different. We've had different experiences. We've survived the Holocaust. And for the children to say, you know what, we've had different lives than some other children. We've had different experiences. Now it's our time to come out of the closet, so to say, and start talking about it. So many decades went by, nothing had been done. I went in 1985 to the Canadian gathering of Holocaust survivors and descendants with my late father, who was a Holocaust survivor from Hungary, as you'll hear from Deborah. And at that time, it was so powerful that over the years, we talked about doing it again, bringing people together to share memory, to create dialogue. And I always told my father I would do it again when the time was right. Well, 75 years seemed like the right time. My father's been gone for 10 years now. It wasn't going to include him. And at the time that COVID hit, we had almost 10,000 people registered, including students from across Canada. We had survivors and descendants, academics, people just involved in the space. We had 120 speakers. We had 20 worldwide exhibits, art installations. I mean, any way you can think about representing the Holocaust, we had as part of Liberation 75, and then COVID hit. So what we've been doing in the meantime is creating events almost every month now to continue the dialogue that we started. So we like to think of Liberation 75 not so much as an event, but more of a movement to bring people together, to bring organizations like AJR together with other organizations that hadn't collaborated in the past. And funny that, you know, the upside of COVID is that COVID has facilitated collaboration with the help of all this amazing technology. So if you want to find out more about Liberation 75 and the events that we're holding and our announcement of the future 2021 event, please sign up for updates at liberation75.org. And a special thank you to Michael Newman, who both chaired our programming committee and is on our planning committee. He's, as you all know, an unbelievable mensch, and he's been just, you know, such a help to us. And thank you so much, Michael and Deborah, for inviting me to be here today.
Well, thank you for that unexpected compliment. I can see nobody was nodding in agreement with you, so I'm not sure that last bit is true in any way. But
I'm sure they are.
Thank you very much for saying so, and I do all encourage you to have a look at the extensive information on the website, because it really was a tremendous amount of work went into the programming. And of course, it's poignant and significant that we're holding this meeting today on this, which of course is the anniversary, 3rd of September, the outbreak of Second World War. So it seems somehow very poignant and destined that we should be organizing some kind of big event or connecting with some big event today, of all days. So thanks very much for that, Marilyn. And of course, welcome also to Debbie. I'm calling you Debbie. It seems to be everybody calling you Debbie. Debbie Levison, the author.
Debbie is great. Unless you're mad at me already, then you call me Deborah.
No, although I noticed you haven't complimented me either. But we'll gloss over that for now. The author of The Crate, and you're going to be in conversation with Marilyn in just a moment. So welcome to you as well. And you're joining us from, as I found out, Muskoka, a sort of northern part, north of Toronto, and Marilyn is in Toronto. So welcome from the other side of the water to you both. And just as a quick introduction, Deborah is the author of The Crate, which she and Marilyn are going to discuss now. So I'll hand over to you, Marilyn. Thank you both very much for joining us, and to everybody enjoy the conversation. Just a quick, for those who've just joined at the end, if you have a question, please use the chat function at the bottom of the screen, and my colleague Deborah, who will be fielding questions for you. Ladies, over to you.
Thank you so much, Michael. And so with that, I'm going to introduce our very special guest today, Debbie Levison. So Debbie and I have a lot in common. We both grew up in Toronto in Hungarian survivor homes. We both attended the University of Toronto. Her book takes place in a region called Muskoka, about 2.5 hours north of Toronto. It's a big cottage area where my family also has a cottage. And in fact, Debbie's brother, Peter, who you learn a lot about in the book, trained in medicine with my husband. So it is indeed a small world, but it was this book, The Crate, that brought Debbie and me together. So for a short introduction, Debbie Levison is an award-winning author, journalist, and publicist. Her writing experience is extensive. For 6 years, she was the Director of Public Relations for Canada for the Israel Ministry of Tourism, based in the Israeli Consulate in Toronto. She's also wrote a regular travel column for a nationwide newspaper in Canada before she left us and relocated in the United States. Since her move, she has written regularly for publications throughout New England and has worked as an editor for many years. Her featured story on the SS St. Louis earned an Award of Excellence from the Society of Professional Journalists. So Levison's first book that we're going to hear about today, a true crime memoir entitled The Crate, A Story of War, a Murder, and Justice, has received 7 literary awards to date. Most recently, it took the first place prize for nonfiction by the Connecticut Press Club and went on to the national competition where it took second place. Levison attended the University of Toronto as well as the Royal Conservatory of Music before moving to Connecticut, where she now lives with one husband, it's good to know just one, 3 children, and a doodle, and a second doodle on the way. Mazel tov on your second doodle on the way, Deb. So Debbie, let's start. Oh, by the way, if you want to learn more about Debbie, she has a website, debbielevison.com. So Debbie, for those who haven't read your amazing book or who need a refresher, what do we need to know? Can you set the stage for us?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, I just need to say thank you also to Michael Newman for inviting me here today, for Deborah Barnes for all her arrangements, and Marilyn, thank you too for jumping on board to do this with me. Very exciting, and thanks to all of you for listening. So yeah, I'll tell you a little bit about the story. The book opens with what was the most surreal phone call of my entire life. In 2010, my brother called me to say that something had happened at our cottage, where I happen to be right now. This is a place that my parents had built by hand in the early 1970s. It's in a very pristine, very beautiful wooded area of northern Canada. And it's a very private sanctuary. That's how I think of it, as a sanctuary. My parents really built it as a safe refuge and an escape, maybe, from all their terrible memories. So my brother said that he had discovered a wooden crate. It had been shoved up underneath this cottage between the floor and the ground, nailed tightly shut and hidden from view. But when the crate was opened, the contents were the most horrific thing you can imagine. And of course, there was an emergency call to the police, and that sort of triggered the media interest in the discovery. And before we knew it, this very private sanctuary of ours was in all the headlines, and it was on television from coast to coast. And my family felt incredibly violated. And of course, here I was. I had 3 fairly young children who I wanted to shield and protect from the horror of the whole situation. And my brother was furious because he became a murder suspect. And my husband and I were totally freaked out. But the worst part of the situation really was that my parents, who were elderly by that time, they were traumatized because they never expected that they would have to encounter this kind of violence again in their lifetimes.
So tell us a little more about why the book is called The Crate.
So the crate is literal and metaphorical. So clearly there was an actual crate, and that's what the story revolves around. That's the true crime aspect of the book, and the book is marketed as a true crime story. But the crate is also metaphorical in terms of our having lifted the lid, so to speak, to look into the past, and we found all of these terrible memories that had been hidden away and buried for so long. And this was the pivotal event that released all of these terrible memories.
So Deb, what are the predominant themes of the book?
Well, one for sure is fate, because, you know, I sort of, I ask the question of fate throughout the story in terms of the Holocaust. You know, was it the fate, was it preordained or predestined for 6 million people to die in the Shoah? Was it my parents' fate to survive? And at the same time, was it the fate of one poor young woman to end up chopped into pieces in a wooden crate and hidden away in the spidery underbelly of our cottage? And, you know, here I was, as you mentioned earlier in my bio, I've always been a writer, but my whole life I longed to be an author. I always wanted to write a book, and I didn't know what to write about. And then this story just lands in my lap. And not only does it land in my lap and give me the pretext for writing a book, but it was the hook for being able to tell my parents' Holocaust stories and do the work of educating people about the Holocaust. Was that my fate? So that's definitely one of the questions I ask. And then the other part of the book, another theme woven throughout, is what people are capable of. You know, it turns out I knew the murderer. And I always thought of him as a teddy bear, a very big, gentle guy. And so I asked, you know, what are these sort of unremarkable people, your next door neighbor who brings you a cup of sugar or who comes for dinner? Is there a monster lurking under the surface? Because when we think of the Holocaust, that was very much the case. The lifelong friends and neighbors of Jews all of a sudden turned on them and showed that they were capable of pretty extraordinary evil. And by the same token, think of the Nazi guards who woke up every morning and sat down to have breakfast with their children and then kissed their wives goodbye before they went off to work. And their work was torturing and killing Jews. So the question of what people are actually capable of is definitely one of the themes.
It's very extraordinary. First of all, it's an extraordinary story. I mean, I know Muskoka region very, very well, and to have a murder, like a gruesome murder like that, really turned the whole community upside down. People, you know, could not believe it. But to have this happen in the home, essentially, of Holocaust survivors was something that I found absolutely fascinating. So, first of all, tell me, how much of this book is fiction and how much is real?
So it's nonfiction, and I tried as much as humanly possible not to embellish the facts in any way. And I am very comfortable calling it a nonfiction. By the same token, I can't say that I remember every conversation from when I was 7 years old down to the letter, but I did try not to add anything to the facts, and I tried not to add anything to my parents' stories except the way they were told to me, except for the way I discovered them, word for word. And I think, had I given myself the leeway to make it a fiction, or had I given myself that sort of literary license to pad my parents' words and to add more drama and add even more context, it would have been a more educational book. And that education being one of my primary goals for writing the story. But I think, you know, had I been able to add a lot more information about my parents' experiences in the Holocaust, I think would have made it more dramatic And indeed, I've learned a lot more, for instance, about Mauthausen, which was one of the concentration camps, one of 3 that my father was imprisoned in. So I know a lot more about that camp now than I did when I was writing it, but I really tried to limit myself to the story the way it was told to me.
So I know you have some slides to show. Can you take us through your journey?
Yes. So just a few, not my, here we go. Let me know if this comes up for you. Are you seeing a PowerPoint?
Not yet. We see you're sharing the screen, but we don't see the screen yet. There it is.
Okay, let me know when you see it. You got it?
Yes.
So, so this is a pared down version of the PowerPoint that I usually give in my author talks, but I'll take you through very quickly. So here obviously is the book, and this is the house where I grew up in Toronto. A very quiet house, a very immaculate house where I walked on eggshells. Because I remember even as a very small child, the feeling of not showing anger, never talking back, never disobeying my parents because they seemed so fragile, as if I said the wrong word or if I did the wrong thing, they would shatter at any moment. And in this house, first of all, it was not a very Jewish neighborhood. But still, I felt very much like a stranger in a strange land living in Toronto because my family seemed so different from the other families around us. You know, one of my early observations was, well, how come all my friends and neighbors seem to have these big birthday parties in their backyards with lots of aunts and uncles and cousins? And why don't I have any aunts and uncles and cousins? Because in my family, we were 5 people. We were my mother and father, 1 brother, and my maternal grandmother, and me. And that was the extent of my entire family. And then that little 5-person family was very different from the ones around us. You know, we spoke a different language. I didn't learn English until I started school. I spoke Hungarian until kindergarten, and we ate very different foods. You know, my mother was actually a very good cook, but she would make these giant vats of these very mushy Hungarian stews because it was economical, and 1 big pot of this stuff would last for 4 or 5 dinners. And she dressed me in this sort of Eastern European style that was kind of ugly, honestly, and very out of style, very out of fashion. So there were lots of things to distinguish us from the other families. But of course, it didn't occur to me until later that, well, wait, Toronto is really an immigrant city. It's a culture made up of lots of different immigrants living in a mosaic. And there were lots of people who spoke different languages or ate different foods. And so there was something else that distinguished my family. And as a child, I couldn't identify it, except to say that there was like a black cloud over our lives. So here's my mother back in Hungary in her bocskai uniform. She was about 11 years old in this picture, and all smiles, clearly, before the Nazi occupation of Hungary in March 19th of 1944. And I just want to tell you a tiny bit about her childhood. She was an only child and very much doted on by her parents. And she went to the local Scottish missionary school, which was a Protestant school, and such a warm and accepting environment that over the years, the school actually came to have a population of students that was half Jewish and half non-Jewish. And they even invited a rabbi in on Fridays to teach Torah in a Protestant private school. And the founder of the school, you in the United Kingdom actually may know her name, Jane Haining. She was a Scottish missionary and a very remarkable woman. She founded the school, and she was a very warm and caring woman herself. And once things got bad in Budapest, where the school was, where my mother lived, once things got bad and people were being deported and it wasn't safe for Jews to be out in the streets anymore, the Scottish church actually recalled all its missionaries from all around Europe, brought them back to Scotland. Jane Haining happened to be in Scotland on holiday when that happened, and she defied that order by the church and traveled back to Hungary, back to Budapest at great peril to herself, because she said that her place was protecting the Jewish children in her charge. And she had a housekeeper at the school who was non-Jewish and turned out to be a huge Nazi sympathizer. And when Jane found that out, she dismissed the housekeeper. And in turn, the housekeeper's son denounced Jane to the authorities as a collaborator. And so they came and took her away, with children who were boarding at the school, took them all to Auschwitz, where they all perished in the gas chambers. And Jane Haining is thought to be one of, if not the only, Scottish national to die in Auschwitz. And there are some beautiful memorials to her, by the way. There's one in Scotland and one in Budapest and one at Yad Vashem. So here's father, and he looks to be about 15, 16 years old. You know, he still has that sort of adolescent chubbiness to his cheeks. And this also is before the Nazi occupation of his village. Now, he lived in a small village called Balassagyarmat, about 2 hours north of Budapest. And like my mother, once the Nazis occupied, he was brought into what they formed to be a ghetto in his village. And he remembers thinking at the time that the greatest problem that he was having was that he might not be allowed to graduate. So he was 17 by 1944. And really wanted his high school diploma, because if he didn't have that, then he wouldn't be in engineering in the fall. And so, you know, he was thinking along this very orderly timeline of how his life would play out, you know, a very normal timeline of graduating high school, going on to college, and so on. And of course, that's not how it turned out, because in May of that summer of 1944, they came and took away the adult males for forced labor, including my grandfather, my father's father. And that was the last time he ever saw his father. But later in the summer, in June, they came back for the younger boys. And at the age of 17, my father was the youngest of a group of about 200 boys who were taken away for forced labor, taken on a cattle car, kept in the cattle car without food or water for 5 days as the cars switched on and off the tracks to make way for the Nazi trains. He was kept in that cattle car, standing up, packed in so tight that he couldn't lift his arms from his sides. And, you know, this is something that I tried to describe to non-Jewish audiences who may not have a sense of what these events were like. But imagine being packed in with a group of boys so tightly that teenage boys died standing up. So when the cattle car doors finally opened and those who could stumbled off, my dad, Steve, found himself in the first of 3 concentration camps. The first was called Fertőrakos in the very west of Hungary at the border of Austria. And that was a labor and transit camp where he stayed for several months. And from there, he continued by death march and another train ride to Mauthausen. Let me just, yeah, okay. So I didn't include photos of Mauthausen, but I feel that it's really important that you have a sense of what it was like there. And many of you may be familiar with the name. It's probably one of the better known camps. But Mauthausen was intentionally brutal. It was intentionally made as a brutal camp because it was classified as a step 3 concentration camp, Stufe 3, if I have the pronunciation right in German. It was intended to be one of the toughest camps because that's where they housed a lot of the political prisoners, the people who were opposed to the Reich. And so the regime there was incredibly brutal. First of all, they had a series of steps. Mauthausen was built into a working quarry with very high, very sheer granite cliffs. And there was a series of 186 steps that went from the bottom of this quarry to the top of the cliffs. It was called the Stairs of Death. The prisoners, the Jewish prisoners of Mauthausen, were given this task. They were made to carry granite blocks strapped to their backs from the bottom of the quarry to the top of the cliffs. And that was their daily job. They would stagger up these stairs, and of course, being severely underfed and overworked, many of them collapsed, and then that sort of created a domino effect where everyone went rolling back down the stairs. But they were told to carry these granite blocks up the stairs. Now imagine that the average weight of these granite blocks was 110 pounds, and the average weight of the adult male prisoner at Mauthausen was 88 pounds. So after a day's work, the Nazi guards had a favorite game that they would make the prisoners play. They would choose 2 at a time, 2 prisoners at a time, and make them race up the stairs carrying their granite blocks. And whoever made it to the top was given a choice. There would be a prisoner there at the top waiting at a place called Parachutist's Wall. And the next prisoner was given a choice: either push the prisoner in front of him over the cliff or be shot dead himself. So that was the game that they played each night after a day of work. And in addition to that, apparently survivors of Mauthausen reported something like 66 different ways that the Nazi guards killed the prisoners. There were things like the ice showers, where prisoners, young boys, were made to take showers in the middle of winter, the brutal winter, and of course many of them died of hypothermia. And they kept barrels of water strategically located all around the camp, just in case a guard felt the random need to drown a prisoner at any given moment. In any case, this was the place where my father was imprisoned for several months of the winter of 1944 and going on into the spring of 1945. And he endured horrors that he never talked about. He never talked about what happened to him. So I didn't know about the torture and the beatings and having to stand outside in nothing but the thin cotton uniforms that they were given for hours at a time to be counted. I didn't know about the lice or the starvation. And I didn't know that by the spring of 1945, my father weighed about 90 pounds. And so it was not until the spring, until about April of 1945, that my father was taken from Mauthausen to a sub-camp. Mauthausen actually being the umbrella name for a group of camps, but he was taken on another death march to Gunskirchen. And that's where he was at the time of liberation, when the American Allies came to liberate the camp. So, and there is quite a bit more detail in the book, but like I said, I know more about Mauthausen than I did when I was writing it in 2012. And now I'm very thankful that my dad didn't talk about his experiences as a child, because it haunts me now. I mean, these images keep me awake at night now. I can't imagine how I would have felt knowing this when I was much younger, had he been. So this is my parents when they met, when they both were liberated. My mother had been in the ghetto in Budapest for the duration of 44 and 45, Hungary being one of the last countries to be occupied, as I'm sure you know. But they met and were married in 49. They actually met at a wedding and were married in Budapest in 1949, and had my brother a couple of years later. And then in 1956, were able to escape from what had become fascist Hungary, you know, under communism. I'm sorry, communism. They escaped from communist Hungary and made their way by foot to Austria, and then eventually were able to make their way to the port to take the Empress of Britain, the ship that had a quota of 700 refugees per voyage. Took that ship to New Brunswick, Canada, where they were able to start their new lives. And so here they are a few years later, their residency photos when they had been in Canada for a bit. And shortly after this, they were able to sponsor my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, who by another series of miracles had also survived the Holocaust, having been on her way to Auschwitz as well. So, you know, this whole series of circumstances, I'm sure all of you second generation viewers now have a lot of experience with hearing stories where it's just one miraculous escape or one miraculous survival after another. And my family was no exception. But here they are in Canada, and so grateful to be there, living in a country of refugees and immigrants. And here is our entire family. I think this was my first birthday, but here's the 5 of us in 1965. And so, you know, my parents settled into Toronto society and to the Canadian culture. And by the 70s, by the early 70s, this culture included what was called the cottage country dream. And my parents were very eager to be part of that whole dream, which was to own a summer property north of the city, a place where they could escape on the weekends and in the summers. And it's this glorious place called Muskoka that Michael had been mentioning at the beginning. And that's what they wanted. They wanted a place of their own where they could put down roots that would be uniquely theirs. And this ended up being our cottage. So this is where I am right now. The yellow tape that you see is actually the caution tape. OPP stands for Ontario Provincial Police. This is the morning after the crate was opened, where the police cordoned it off as a crime scene. And this is the view from the lake looking up. So you can see that the property actually slopes pretty steeply up a hill. It's up a pretty steep incline. And so the front of the cottage is on stilts, and it creates an angled space underneath. And that space is where the crate was discovered. And here you see the murderer and his victim. And for those of you who have not read the book, no spoilers, I won't mention any names because there are elements of mystery that I try to maintain in the story. And then I'll end with this, a picture of my children, because really this book, you know, the family history is my parents' legacy for the next generation. So these are my kids. And it's very much why I wrote the book, so that they would know their family stories. And there are some other reasons as well. But I'm going to shut off my PowerPoint now and come back to Marilyn.
Debbie, thank you. That was an amazing presentation, and you really set the stage for who you are and how you grew up and what your parents went through. And it's fascinating. And what's fascinating to me is that you had to go into kind of a dark place twice. Any of us who have ever written our parents' stories, and it's a difficult thing, not everybody does, there's a code of silence in many Holocaust families, but you actually had to go into two very dark places. What emotional toll did that take on you?
So I can't say it was cathartic in any way. So to talk about the crime, I felt was a very important thing, because when it was first reported in the media, a lot of the coverage really did that blame the victim kind of a thing, which made me angry. You know, the young woman who was the murder victim made some questionable choices in her life, but to blame the victim, I thought was absolutely outrageous. And so I felt that she had a story that needed to be told, that if I didn't tell her story, no one would, that she would become a statistic, and a forgotten statistic at that. So I felt it was really important to tell her story and correct what I thought was a lot of slander in the media. And as far as my parents' stories went, that was incredibly hard. Not for me, but because it made me realize again, on a conscious level, how much pain they'd lived through, and how hard they worked to protect me from that pain by never talking about it. You know, even then I had a sense that there was some story in their backgrounds that they'd hidden from me, even though they never talked about it. You know how kids pick things up in conversations. And there were lots of little clues scattered along the way, but which I talk about in the book too. But it was really their pain that was hard for me to write about. But it also sort of clarified in my mind how much their experiences shaped my life and shaped me as a person. And it wasn't until I started writing all of this that I began to identify as a child of survivors, because that was not the predominant factor that identified me before that. And it certainly does now. It absolutely does now.
So there's a paragraph in your book I'm going to read, and I really loved this. It said, "My parents perpetually worried that something bad would happen to Peter and me. So many atrocious things had happened to people they loved. Making sure we were warm, fed, clean, happy. No chores, no demands, no bad news seemed to be Mom's absolute priorities, and she never failed, not once, to put our needs before her own, to insulate us as much as humanly possible from sadness, grief, fear, discomfort. Sometimes we felt like we were suffocating, but then Mom had lots of extra love, yes, left unused after her relatives disappeared. She had to put it somewhere." I love that. I love the way you so vividly described the experiences that I think so many 2Gs can absolutely relate to. In fact, I'm going on gallery mode for a second. How many people here, by show of hands, if your video is open, are 2Gs? Can you put your hands up if you are a child of a Holocaust survivor? Awesome. How many people can relate to the experiences that Debbie talks about? Okay, so we've got some hands up. So Deb, as you're going through this journey as a 2G, what have you learned about the 2G experience? How are we different?
Well, there are definite commonalities, but huge differences because, you know, every survivor has lived a different life after leaving Eastern Europe. And for instance, I have one friend who wrote a memoir of growing up as a 2G. And whereas I talked about how much I was smothered, almost to the point of suffocating, how I was so overprotected as a child, her perspective was the opposite. She was physically and verbally abused by her mother. Her mother went as far as to say to her, I suffered as a child, so you should too. You should know what it feels like. So, you know, there is a wide range of 2G experiences, and I've now met lots of other authors of their parents' stories, and a lot of other 2G or 3G members of organizations that I'm part of now. And the commonalities, I think, outweigh the differences. You know, I think Helen Epstein, in her pivotal, groundbreaking Children of the Holocaust, talked about one of the so-called symptoms, which I find for me and lots of other people I know, for instance, the inability to remember our dead relatives' names. I don't know if any of you have that experience, but unless they're written down for me, I cannot remember, no matter how many times I've read them or have been told, can't remember my dead relatives' names. And then there's that sort of overwhelming guilt of living an easy life when we know that our parents suffered so much. And there is also tremendous pressure to be happy, to be accomplished in place of all the loved ones who perished. So I think there are a lot of commonalities. Marilyn, how about you?
Oh, amazing commonalities. I also, something that I found interesting that I had a realization on about a year ago was that none of us talk about our murdered relatives in sort of the personal. We don't say my grandfather. We often will say my father's father, my mother's father, my mother's sisters. We refer in a very kind of detached way to those people. Like you say, we don't remember their names. We have trouble remembering the names, but we also don't say, you know, my aunts and uncles were murdered. We often say my parents' siblings were murdered. There's a lot of very detached language around these relationships, which I thought was very interesting. I've worked with a lot of 2Gs, and I find there are definite commonalities, and they seem to become more pronounced. What I'm finding now is the interesting experiences of the 3Gs and how their experiences are completely different than their parents, particularly in terms of their relationships with their survivor grandparents, who are very, very open with their grandchildren about their experiences while they were extremely close to their children. And I think that while they were trying to I guess, save us from the pain, they feel a tremendous obligation to educate the third generation and can somehow do it in a very, very open way. So my question, how did your mother feel about you writing this book? I know your father had passed by the time you wrote the book, but how did your mother feel about you writing it? There's a lot of very personal family history in this book.
Mm-hmm. So I have to tell you, well, first of all, it's hard to get any kind of objective feedback from my mom because anything I do is wonderful for her. But I think she was very glad, you know, despite the fact that she had already been in Canada for many decades, and despite the fact that she had a fantastic vocabulary, she also had still has a very thick accent. And she was always embarrassed by that accent, and she always felt that she couldn't express herself the way she would like to. And so to have her writer daughter tell her story, she was absolutely thrilled. She said, I never thought a book would be written about my life. She must have read it 25 times. But I did want to just add to what you had said before about the grandparents being more open with their grandchildren, because my experience now is that many survivors who are, you know, in their 70s, 80s, 90s, I think they get to a point that they realized they had kept these events and experiences secret their whole lives. And if they didn't tell them now while they could, then the history would die with them. So I think at the end of their lives, or closer to the end of their lives, survivors are much more inclined to tell their stories because they realize they're running out of time. And that definitely has been my mother's impetus.
Amazing. And what do your children, your beautiful children, an amazing picture of them, what do they think about this story?
So, well, the older two who were young kids in the book and who are now 27 and 24, you know, can definitely appreciate the family history and the nature of the story. The youngest, who's 18 and who had just dropped off in college for the first time, hasn't even read the book yet. So I think he's read little bits and pieces. Drives me crazy, but I think, you know, he'll get to the point in his life where he'll want to know the history. He's not there yet.
Interesting, very interesting. And we have a couple of comments here. One, I love this, for Eva Clark. You can put your hand up, Eva, if you're on the video. Deborah might be interested to know, my mother arrived in Mauthausen in April 1945, weighing 70 pounds. She gave birth to me on April 29th at the gates of the camp. So Eva, you are truly a miracle. You are a miracle child who needs to be acknowledged. We have a question from Miriam Klein-Kasanoff, who everybody needs to follow as well, out of the Miami Holocaust Center. She's brilliant. She says, how do you feel about living at the cottage after finding that horrific crate?
I'm sorry, your voice went out. Say it again.
Sorry, Miriam wants to know, how did you feel about living at the cottage after finding that horrific crate?
Well, so I'm here now, and I have to tell you that during the day when the sun is shining and the birds are singing, it's very easy to forget. You know, the discovery was now 10 years ago. So as soon as it's dark, though, I start remembering. And it really, so this is another theme of the book, about how crimes and violence and evil can really desecrate, can really shatter the innocence of a place, how an event can change the nature of a place. And for me, the cottage will never have the innocence that it had before the event. And so it's very much in my mind when I'm here, especially with my children.
If there was one thing you wanted us to know, something that was a revelation for you, or something that could, you know, be a thought you want to leave us with, what would it be?
So, well, I guess this was the other reason that I wrote the book. And some of you from Canada, I don't know if there's anyone who's tuned in from the States, but there was a very large study of millennials done a couple of years ago in the spring of 2018. And the results were so shocking, so disturbing, that huge numbers, a huge percentage, I think 2/3 of millennials who were surveyed had never heard of Auschwitz, didn't know what it was, had never been taught about the Holocaust. And, you know, the survey, the results went on from there, that millennials just didn't know how many Jews had been killed, or what the nature of the Holocaust was, and so on. And you know, looking back, I didn't have any formal Holocaust education, and neither did my children. Although now I think one of the Elie Wiesel books, Night, is part of the American curriculum. I don't know what the standard is in the UK or actually in Canada, but not enough formal Holocaust education by any means. And so here we are in a place where Holocaust denial is rampant, especially on the internet, where people can be anonymous and the vermin can, really crawl out of the woodwork and say what they want. And the anti-Semitism is just exploding in the United States and in Europe. And so I just feel how critical it is to tell our parents' stories and to write everything down, to preserve and to document as much as we possibly can for future generations.
And would you have any advice to people who want to document their parents' stories?
First of all, there are a lot of people who are willing to help. I've noticed if you go on Facebook, there are dozens of survivor Facebook groups and children of survivor Facebook groups. And a lot of people post, I would like to tell my parents' stories, but I don't know how. And then immediately dozens of people volunteer to help. And, as a writer, I'm definitely one of those people who's glad to help other people write a story down. But even just taking a video, and I noticed that Michelle is on this Zoom call, and she has a pretty incredible format that she's launched as well for telling parent stories and survivor testimony on video. So it doesn't matter really what the format is. I chose a book, other people write a short story, other people just tape it on their phone, but the point is to get it preserved in one format or another.
So the first time I went to Auschwitz, which I resisted doing for many years, as my family members were murdered there, I thought it would swallow me up, but going there liberated me. Did writing this book swallow you up, or did it liberate you?
I think I'm still being swallowed. I think, the process of learning more and more of the history and hearing all of these different stories, because the stories and the variety of survivor stories is just endless, it seems to me, limitless. And every time I hear all of these different stories, I'm swallowed up again. And I think that'll just be how it continues. How can we not be swallowed by this incredible historical event, this unparalleled event that I hope remains unparalleled.
So for those of you who didn't see my initial caption, you can order Deb's incredible book. I think you're going to enjoy it tremendously. It's dark in places, but it's optimistic also, and it's a beautiful story of family and of resilience and survival. You can order it on Amazon. You can go on to Debbie's website, debbielevison.com, for more information. And we look forward to future writings of Debbie's. And I want to thank everybody on behalf of AJR for joining today's book club. And I'll give the last message from you, Michael.
Well, thank you both very, very much. And if nothing else, your amazing promptness. We're exactly at 5 o'clock. This must be also the legacy of the Continental. We call it the Yeka mentality, to be very punctual, very timely. So thank you very much for that. And also, Debbie, just listening to this story, and I say that word in all its senses, is really quite remarkable. And I certainly think it's something that will resonate very strongly with a lot of our members. Just listening to you talk about Jane Henning, one of the things we do in normal times is we have a series of regional get-togethers for our members in different parts of the country. And so a couple of years ago, we had our annual get-together for members in Scotland. And we invited a minister from the Scottish government. You'll know one of the quirks of British politics is that there are devolved governments in different parts. But anyway, there's a minister in Scotland who came to the event as our speaker, and he spoke about Jane's work and life. And so her legacy is acknowledged at the highest levels within government as well, which is important when it comes to messaging about combating anti-Semitism and awareness generally of Holocaust and post-Holocaust issues. So I just thought you'd like to know that. But thank you also very much. And thank you, Marilyn, for chairing and steering the ship so masterfully for this last hour or so, just to tease out some of these themes and issues which really do resonate. And being third generation myself, I can also, that's a whole other hour subject, but it's something which I think grabs the attention and the interest of our members. So thank you all very much, and thank you for those who submitted questions as well, and for fielding those, Marilyn. And as we started at the beginning, come back to when we started, just as a reminder to all the different events and activities that the AJR continues to put on. The book club events and the author events, I have to say, have probably been some of the most popular things we've done these past few months, including today. So thank you again. Please do two things. One, get a copy of the crate, and secondly, go on and look at Liberation 75. Between them, it's a wealth of information and a fascinating read. So thank you both very much. Thank you all, everybody, for joining us. Tempted to say safe journeys home, but you're already there. So go and enjoy your tea or your lunch, wherever you are. And we look forward to seeing you all again soon. Thank you, Susan and Deborah, for doing the tech stuff as well today.
Thank you, everyone. It was a pleasure.
See you on.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.